for the invitation. I put this box of videos that was on the floor up here to prop up my notes, but I saw that they have a copy of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, so if we can agree afterwards that we don't have any questions, we might actually just watch this for the rest of the time. Okay, my focus in this talk is on the circulation of public meanings of racism, how the circulation is shaped and acted upon in the digital media environment, and the significance of this circulation for forms of anti-racism that seek to name racism, the better to mobilize and confront it. It comes from conceptualizing a book that Kathy mentioned that I've been writing, which started out as a book about racism in the media, which was based on the idea that there hadn't been a kind of evaluation for quite a while of research on themes that are pretty well established in studies of media power, the politics of representation, and so on. But as I started work, it soon shifted to something else, which was racism and the media, rather. That is, while media power hasn't been radically transformed, as many might optimistically claim, there have been important shifts in who and how media content is produced and disseminated. This broader canvas of media work doesn't only shift, very obviously, how we think about the media and who acts in it and who acts through it, but it is also of significance for thinking about how racialized meaning is produced and circulated. So I realized I'd have to try to account for this, to try to account for the way in which these media transformations are generative. They do something to the operation of racisms, and thus there are significance to practices of anti-racism also. But in this lecture I want to think about this specifically in relation to the idea that David Theo Goldberg proposes of post-racialism. His opening, I have kind of 3 screens I notice here, like sort of 3 screens outside Brighton, Sussex or something like that. His opening observation in 2015's Are We All Post-Racial suggests an apparent contradiction. The more racism is regarded as having been overcome in a putatively so-called post-racial era, the more it's discussed, defined, and denied. I want to suggest that what he's talking about here isn't a contradiction, but it's a dimension in the reproduction of racisms. What I want to call in this lecture the contemporary debatability of racism. Let me give you a very banal example of what I have in mind. Anyone who's spent any time discussing racism in online comment threads or social media fora might have encountered a moment where the disagreement and the ambiguity peaks, and then a helpful interlocutor pastes a definition from Google Dictionary or something like this into the thread. Prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race on the belief that one's own race is superior. Now, anyone who's had this definition pasted their way may recognize that this dictionary definition doesn't hold out the promise of shared understanding. Instead, it's a full stop. It's inserted into an exchange to say what we are discussing cannot be racism, or what you are experiencing cannot be racism, because it does not relate to the terms of this definition. And we all know how this escalates. It's about 2 degrees away from P.S. Islam is not a race. Now, analytically, A. Sivanandan's pithy formulation that racism never stands still is one of many reminders that racisms are constantly being made and remade. To continue his quote, changing shape, size, contours, purpose, function with changes in the economy, the social structure, the system, and above all, the challenges, the resistances to that system. And yet, as the use of the Google definition suggests, this political and social motility that Sivanandan describes collides with a dominant public understanding of racism as a unitary phenomenon, racism in the singular, frozen in time. In his discussion of the post-racial horizon, Barner Hess sets the scene for this friction. I put all the quotes onto 2 slides to kind of talk through them. What he's talking about here, as he says, is the idea that the sociality of racism, the political discussion of the meaning of racism, he argues, seems to be over in the West. What remains, he says, is seen as a residuum. Racism is a pathology, a profound moral deviation from the Western liberal and democratic ethos and ethnos. It's been declared an unacceptable form of Western social behaviour, committed by groups voluntarily on the political fringes of society, or desperately by classes economically jettisoned to its decaying edges. And he tells here, I think, or relates in very compressed form, probably quite a familiar narrative from the literature for many of you. The Google definition, with its emphasis, its unabashed emphasis in the belief in the hierarchy of races, is an artifact marked by this conviction, what Hess calls that the political discussion of the meaning of racism seems to be over in the West. So inserted into a conversation, this definition acts as a discursive block. Racism may never stand still, but to discuss these shifts as racism is to be immobilized. It's to be, as Alana Lenton has described it, has termed an understanding of racism that is frozen in relation to past events that have been sanctioned for identification as racist in the kind of timeline that Hess gives us in this quotation. So this tension is a recurrent one, and it's something that you see quite a lot in the literature on post-racialism, that the over-identification of racism with particular historical formations constricts an understanding of how so-called new racisms take shape and function. But also, of course, this Google definition is a digital artifact. It's made readily available by one of the world's largest and most powerful corporations, appearing in an authoritative position at the top of the screen. It's unnecessary to click on it to access it, unlike the lesser ranked options organized beneath it. It can be screen grabbed and thus transformed into what Dear I. Murphy calls a digital object that can be combined and recombined with other such objects as it circulates. Pasted into a comment thread, it alters the discursive economy. The task for the respondent to this definition is now to show why what Google says is not racism, and that what you say is racism is actually true. I cut and paste, you need to write me an essay. This kind of banal micro-interaction illustrates something of what I'm trying to say with this idea of the debatability of racism. My starting point is the observation that racism in public culture is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The very mention of race serves as an invitation to disprove its salience. The mention of racism is an invitation to refute its relevance. In the contemporary political context, to speak publicly about racism is to be immediately integrated into an intensive contest, a process of delineation, deflection, denial, a contest over who gets to define racism when everybody in the mythology of contemporary communications gets to speak about it. Of course, this contestation is not new, and the denial of racism, as so much race-critical theory demonstrates, has long been integral to racism's operations. This dynamic, this debatability, is also a consequence of racism's complexity, and the complexity of racisms across time and space. And it's not only complex, it's political. I'm sure many here who witness and experience the general marginalization of thinking about race and racism in the social sciences are acutely aware that the process of conceptualizing racism is intensely political, because racism is political and its recognition entails political consequences. But what I am arguing is that this debatability is conjunctural. It's amplified by an intersection between post-racialism and the discursive prerogatives, the communication structures, and the political economy of the digital media environment. My use of post-racialism here is taken from Goldberg, for whom it is more than just confusion as to what constitutes racism or enduring or ideological denial of the enduring reality of race. What is at work in what he calls post-racialism is the restructuring of the conditions of racist expression and their terms of articulation. So post-racialism, he argues, is a mode through which racism is reformed, through which populations and identities are marked out as suspicious, as problems to be contained, intervened in, or disposed of, in societies where race is regarded as a historical deviation overcome. Post-raciality, Goldberg argues, increasingly erases or erodes the possibilities of identifying racisms and their underpinnings, their structures, their implications. In much of the writing about post-racialism, the struggle to name racism is in the face of silencing, in the face of erasure. Racism is muted, in Dana Ian Davis's term. What I want to argue here is that the experience of racism and the operation of forms of racism can be denied not just through silencing, but also through noise. Not just through a lack of attention to racism, but through an excess of particular kinds of attention. This debatability, this incessant, recursive attention as to what counts as racism and who gets to define it, has political consequences for those practices of anti-racism that want to name racism publicly, the better to mobilize and confront it. It's not incidental that two recent best-selling books, Rainey Ito Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and Ijeoma Oluo's So You Want to Talk About Race, center the vexed question of talking. In both, the statement-like titles capture a tension between the political desire to find ways to talk about the operations of race and an exhaustion at the repetitive and routine nature of not just denial, but the kind of dynamic captured by Sara Ahmed when she writes of how those who talk about racism are thus heard as creating rather than describing a problem. In both cases, the books are also shaped by their experiences of trying to talk about race in highly mediated environments. Rainey's book is developed from a widely shared blog post and a subsequent 5 years of agitation, frustration, exhausting explanations, and paragraph-long Facebook comments, as she writes. She continues, I've written this book to articulate that feeling of having your voice and confidence snatched away from you in the cocky face of the status quo. I won't ever stop myself speaking about race. Every voice raised against racism chips away at its power. We can't afford to stay silent. This book is an attempt to speak. So my focus here in this talk is on the communicative conditions and dynamics under and through which voices are raised and voices are raised against them. My analysis for this talk is mainly restricted to systemic questions, which is not to deny there is much to be said about practices, for example about the ways in which anti-racists use connective media or the proliferation of racist trolling, hate speech and targeting facilitated by digital media platforms, and maybe we can discuss those aspects later on. But in taking Goldberg's idea of postracialism as, to quote him again, the restructuring of the conditions of racist expression, I wanted to examine the affinities between this expression and the forms and platforms of expression in a mediated context predicated on a number of things, among them the accelerated production of content and an endless incitement to opinion and an incitement to discourse. It's worth pointing out here that I don't intend to offer a deterministic account of what media do or some kind of media-centric account of racism, and if I did, there's people here in this audience who'd pull me up pretty quickly about it, I know that. Mediacentrism, as Nick Colby argues, substitutes an assumption about media consequentialism for opening up, to quote him, the difficult, causal questions about how and to what extent media materials work in the social world. While media studies has a rich and highly varied engagement with the politics of race, it is the case that the centrality of the question of representation has led to a tendency to treat the world as, to quote Jason Toynbee, who's over there, and David Hesmondog, a product of representation, with the media then being the central means of that representation. That said, the absence of any sustained attention to media and communications in social theory engagements with race and racism is even more pronounced than mediacentrism. If racism never stands still, then the general attention to questions of media and its significance in theorizing this mutability, this never standing still, is puzzling, particularly in societies where the ubiquity of media and the penetration of media logics to political processes and social forms is so widely remarked upon. Social theory, to generalize, is content to cite media as a source or to recognize it as a structure or an agent, but rarely to integrate analysis of communications as something dynamic, as a practice and a process. But to prove that a détente between these is possible and desirable, each of the following arguments works with a concept from social and cultural theory, the social and cultural theory of race, and reads it in relation to a different dimension of the media and communications system. I want to explore this first dimension of two, with reference to Miri Song's work on what she calls a culture of racial equivalence in Britain. In a working paper in subsequent British Journal of Sociology article, she situates her discussion of public understandings of racism in the contemporary UK in an argument about the critical need for concepts that are adequate to the shifting dynamics of racism in a multicultural society. Echoing John L. Jackson's notion of racial paranoia in the United States, Miri Song argues that contemporary society is characterized by high levels of awareness of racial identity and of the dangers of committing, to quote, public racial indiscretions, yet also by understandings of racism that are, again to quote, often highly imprecise, broad, and used to describe a wide range of racialized phenomena. A consequence of this, she argues, is, to quote, the growing tendency in Britain to regard almost any form of racial statement made by anyone of any hue as automatically and indiscriminately racist. At first brush, Miri Song's emphasis on the problem of conceptual inflation might seem to contradict the kind of frozen discipline I suggested in relation to the Google definition. But as she argues, this collapse of a very expansive range of racialized interactions into a catch-all category of racism is precisely because of this inattention to formative social relations and the distribution of power in historical and political context. Further, she argues, this equivalence is secured through the proliferation of what she calls mediated accusations of reverse racism. That is a discursive tactic that would be familiar to most, designed to extract a consideration of racism from thinking about historically structured systems of power domination, and reduce it simply to a prejudice that anybody can hold. For Miri Song, the consequences of this conceptual inflation are serious, as the idea of racism, she argues, has been stripped of its historical basis, severity, and power. And in the production of this equivalence, she argues, racialized experiences are relativized, silenced. In exploring this conceptual inflation, she places an important weight on high-profile Twitter storms, and more generally, on the problem of social media. To quote her, "Central to this growth of the culture of racial equivalence are assertions of both racism and reverse racism via newish communication and media technologies, which have instant reach to a huge audience. Typically, such charges of racism and reverse racism tend to be monolithic and delivered in formats which are not conducive to the elaboration of detailed and careful argumentation and explanations. As such, these brief articles, blogs, and tweets do not properly assess the nature and specifics of each racial interaction or event." Now, it is certainly the case, as she suggests, that we cannot separate content from form, but it is also the case that communication is motivated and mediated. That is to say, these communications she's discussing are not just assessing the racial interaction or event, they are fully part of it. The question then is, what if we were to approach this kind of flurry of media productivity not as noise that can be ideally deliberately stripped away, but as a condition of racism's articulation? Take the question she looks at of reverse racism. As Miri Song rightly argues, the rhetoric of reverse racism can be tracked back to deliberate strategies developed in the post-civil rights backlash in the United States and to the influence of the New Right in the UK or the Nouvelle Droite in France. In the imaginary of so-called ordinary white concerns, the gains of formal equality or patchwork multiculturalism are a zero-sum gain. A gain for them is a loss for us. This logic has long been a staple recipe for the formulaic contrarianism that characterises the British right-wing press, and it now provides a kind of structure of opportunity for a broader range of ideological entrepreneurs in an expanded media space. Take, for example, the frankly weird surveillance of student politics by the right-wing press in Britain. The fascination with safe spaces, for example, is a direct expression of this established zero-sum grievance grammar. Look, it says, having done everything required of us and more to include them, look now at these minority students abusing their privilege to exclude us. But at the same time, the logics of reverse racism have long proliferated beyond the designs of new right ideologues and communists, and they provide a kind of vernacular script which is easily reproduced within the discursive structure of Twitter. As Tim Highfield has argued, the strictness of the character limit on tweets has helped foster a social media culture that places importance on concise flippancy. Reverse racism's logic involves a series of sharp responses to an imagined anti-racist hegemony. It thus provides an easily reproduced, essentially scripted response. So every time, for example, a person of colour who seeks to use the platform to speak about racism can simply be accused of bringing race into it. However, again, to focus on tweets simply as expression alone is to neglect how, as Sanjay Sharma has shown, race on Twitter is less a question of racial representation than what he calls an aggregation produced by technocultural assemblages. That is, the software platforms make content available, they manage it, they throttle it, they intensify it, they promote it, or they bury it. And at the same time, Twitter cannot be understood as a discrete platform, unconnected from other platforms in the media environment. The kinds of tweet storms that Miri Song is writing about are regularly integrated into the expansive digital spaces of news production and comment. Racial interactions and events are routinely rendered debatable, Was this racist? Why was X accused of racism? Was this racism? Take our online poll and let us know what you think about racism today. Entering into the professional routines of journalism, racism is rendered debatable where everything can be framed as an issue, and every issue must have two sides. To give an example of this briefly, during the so-called refugee crisis a couple of years ago, a period when the Irish state agreed to receive a tiny group of Syrian refugees and even reneged on that, the prerogative to hear two sides in the debate about migration meant that in the absence of an organised far right in Ireland, simply random operators with their own Facebook page were taken on as concerned citizens to give the other side of the debate, and this amplified enormously within these professional routines. But the point I want to pursue in concluding this argument is slightly different. In her work on communicative capitalism and the left, Jodie Dean has argued that what she calls democracy that speaks without listening is capable of incorporating vast quantities of oppositional and critical commentary by converting messages into contributions. In other words, in deliberative theories of democratic communication, a message has a use value, where understanding is a necessary part of communicative exchange. Under what she terms communicative capitalism, messages are instead defined by their exchange value, by their contribution to a larger pool or flow or circulation of content. In relation to the debatability of racism then, it may be that the tension is between the use value of talking about race and the exchange value of this as content in a media system where racism is a driver of spectacle, a driver of controversy, a reliable incitement to discourse. Take the example of an emergent genre of anti-racist witnessing, the circulation of videos of racist attacks or harassment in public spaces, sometimes recorded by bystanders, sometimes recorded by those subject to the attack. There are certainly enough examples of instances where the upload, circulation and publicity around such an incident has been important for the person attacked, either as a testimony of their experience, but also to witness the deniable reality of racism. It has a use value, in other words. But of course, as this enters into circulation, the personal value of sharing does not prevent an individualizing ritual of debating from taking shape, condemnation and sometimes exoneration of the racist. The problem, as Angela Davis has argued, is that these vignettes are frequently framed as aberrations, particularly when they have a class dimension, and become anachronistic expressions of the bad attitudes and ignorance that is the sum total of what's left of racism. But it is precisely this debatability, of course, this generativity of adjudicating what is and what is not racism, which provides the media exchange value. The question is then, how does one bear witness to one's experience or talk about race under these kinds of conditions? I'll park this question for later discussion with a vignette of my own. In late 2015, when an Ohio grand jury decided that the police officers who shot dead 12-year-old Tamir Rice within seconds of approaching him because he looked much bigger and older than his age would not face charges, the journalist and academic Stacey Patton took to her public Facebook page to write about the ritual of being asked to participate in what she calls the racial spectacle. An editor emailed me just a few minutes ago, she says, to ask if I'd write a 1,200-word reaction to the Tamir Rice decision. I said no. That is, she argued, I won't provide a hot take on demand. When media networks search for an eager academic or journalist or culture critic who can help us decipher all of this inelegant rage because we are totally ignorant about structural racism and the psychosis of white supremacy. We're colorblind after all. Like watching Black Death on viral videos, seeing those of us who carry pens flip our souls inside out on the page to explain all this evil while slowly dying inside from the anger, loss and grief is another form of titillation for corporate media, even the ones who proclaim to be liberal. And the comment sections under our pieces become a fibre optic altar upon which the scourge of white America can ejaculate the worst parts of their souls. Not this time, I will not be your intellectual mammy, I is real tired. Let me turn in my final section to a reflection on digital media and the articulation of racism more directly. A recurring gesture in postracialism is the recuperation of images or ideas that have historically established racial significance as not racist, simply by virtue of their resurrection in an era when racism is, as we now know, apparently mainly a thing of the past. In his essay, The Remainders of Race, Asher Min offers the compelling metaphor of racial debris to understand this kind of reflex. Debris, he argues, involves the rearticulation of racial references, images and logics held to be past, but which are rearticulated under particular political and social conditions, where, to quote him, the potentiality of accumulated racial debris, variegated and dormant from different eras, is ready to be instantiated in unknown ways. In this essay, Amin sets out to explore why racism persists and quickly resurfaces, even though it is thought to be thoroughly dismantled. This required, he argues, digging into what he calls the archaeology of a racial present, the need to explain the relationships between endurance and change in the dynamics of racism, and how, to quote, mixes of past and present racial practices become especially vengeful once again towards the racialized other. Amin's point here can be extended by noting how debris is also digitalized. The internet provides an extended archive and repertoire of racial conceptions and associations, and of course images that proliferate across platforms. In what he calls this vengeful mix of past and present practices, transnational media space provides an extensive opportunity to sift and assemble debris. If bricolage is a key aspect of digital culture, and remixing and parodying drive cultural production, these spreadable dynamics provide media users of all kinds with extended, volatile repertoires of racial reference and suggestion. We can see this intersection of racial and digital debris in something like the stubborn recurrence of blackface, which is a gesture that is buoyed on the one hand by a post-racial claim to innocence, but on the other, it's anchored to contexts where social tensions and political conflicts with a racialized dimension make the appearance of such gestures all the more likely. And of course, these incidents are inevitably mediatized. They're Instagrammed, they're shared, they're revealed in news culture, and drive debatability in the terms previously discussed, often hinging on the adjudication of what Gloria Wekker has termed in relation to Black Pete debates in the Netherlands, the adjudication of white innocence. In the post-racial articulation of racism, the question then is, when does this debris that Asherman talks about turns to shrapnel? In other words, is there anything of significance in how these media and informational conditions for how expressions of racism are formed? Let me turn to an illustration taken this time from my current location in Finland. A couple of years ago, the lead Finnish newspaper, Helsingin Sanomat, reported that the True Finns MP, they were called the True Finns then, now I think they call themselves the Finns. I have other names for them, but they constantly rebrand themselves. But a leading MP, Laura Huhtasaari, who ran this year as the party's candidate in the presidential election, the newspaper revealed that she was the member of a Facebook group that translates as the racist background of rapists that hide in bushes. Now, under this banner, a montage of photos of unnamed men of what appear to be Somali and North African heritage, the group description outlines how it is dedicated to proving how Muslim immigration has increased instances of rape in Finland and other northern European countries. And this is just at the cusp of the so-called refugee crisis when this trope gathered enormous media force. But as well as featuring endless entreaties to defend our culture, the newspaper report drew attention to several instances of overt anti-black racism in the group's posts. Given this unwelcome media attention, Huhtasaari sought to distance herself from it publicly, first contending quite brilliantly, I think, that a rogue algorithm had liked the page for her, and then arguing in an exquisite remix of I'm Not Racist, but that I'm not racist, maybe I could define myself for myself. We'd all love that, love, really, we would. Why should we pay attention to a Facebook group of 740 members minus one? European racism, as Nicholas de Genema has argued, involves posing and answering the question, what do we do with them? Groups such as this are spaces in which this question is posed and answered, but not within a discrete community, but within a transnational digital space of exchange, where debris, stories, facts, images that prove what the problem is and what the problem demands can be linked and assembled. One of the ways in which these assemblages cohere is that they're constantly marked out or mark their distance from racism. While it is certainly true that the so-called alt-right moment is marked by bold expressions of white supremacy and nationalism, the premium placed on irony and transgression as plausible deniability indicates just how important it is for the vast majority of far-right actors to be able to appear as still not racist. But my emphasis here is not on particular movements, but on these spaces of assemblage and how they function, in effect, as discourse laboratories. Take the name of the group that Huhtasaari was definitely not a member of, the racist background of bush rapists. That's as in the jumping out of bushes to attack women. As the group description makes clear, in perpetrating rape on Nordic women, these migrants are also targeting the native population. On this historically suggestive fear of the sexualized primitive other, a range of other racializing discourses are layered. First, of course, there is a border politics, because Nordic women, but also a national way of life, characterized by its love of universal values and freedom and equality, are threatened by non-Western men irresponsibly allowed in to the country by, of course, the multicultural elite, as we know. But the borders are not just of the nation, because secondly, there's a civilizational politics also. The threat is not just those racialized as black who cannot help their primitive urges, but they are also Muslims, mandated by their religion to rape infidels. So when this national way of life and civilizational good is threatened with violation, how can the defense of this good be racism, something that everybody accepts nowadays is bad? Or in the phrase deployed by many of the internet mobilized anti-Islam groups, racism is the lowest form of stupidity, Islamophobia is the height of common sense. Moreover, the aim of the Facebook group is to expose the racist background of the bush-hiding rapists. Its explicit public claim is that of anti-racism, as the violence of rape is also an expression of racism. It draws here not only on the trope of reverse racism discussed earlier, but it is situated and shaped within a transnational flow of racializing ideas and discourses that have been intensively produced and circulated in the post-9/11 era, though obviously they precede this political threshold. A range of theorists, from Shireen Razak to Jasmine Puar, have noted the cumulative articulation of this need, this apparent need, to police national and civilizational boundaries, to protect sexual freedom and gender equality, characteristics that supposedly define us against them. However much anti-Muslim racism today is now associated with street movements, so-called populists, and internet extremists, it must also always be recalled that it is a racism politically produced by the political centre in the post-Cold War era. But in this context of suspicion, surveillance, and integrationism, the racism that takes shape through the media is not just a reflection of these conditions. Racism, as John Solomon and Les Back put it, is a scavenger ideology, and the terrain on which these assemblages emerge is transnational and eclectic. What emerges in the interaction of groups like this is a desire not just to mark difference from racism while sifting the net for debris, for accumulating evidence from here, there, and everywhere that we're not racist, but we recognize the problem of racialized populations. And the problem is, I argue, that we can't just sift through this eclecticism, through the accumulation of posts and memes and links, to locate a foundational racism that renders this kind of bricolage coherent. The bricolage is the racism. The colonial primitive, the migrant as social enemy, the Muslim as invader, the facts of what they do and what they cause. These stereotypes, memes and myths produce and sustain each other dynamically. Eclecticism and continuity, this assemblage is laced by racialized suspicion, but it is woven as a racism that is not about race. It has declared its defense of the universal and the good. It is assertive and unapologetic, correcting the naive mistakes of multiculturalism, and therefore resistant to a critique on multiculturalist and anti-racist terms. Of course, now this remains the output of a small Facebook group, ephemeral, fragmented, and dispersed. The social force of these ideas is limited and contested. And there is a tendency at the moment that I want to mark my distance from, to credit the far right with forms of media genius, simply because many groups take communication seriously and have learned how to insert themselves into the cycles and routines of professional journalism. Without wanting to in any way downplay the dangers posed by the far right, including those networks and proto-movements that take shape on the internet or through social media, it may be that the key significance of social media to racist and nationalist movements is this ceaseless proliferation and mainstream surfacing of right-wing themes and memes, rather than the established functionalist emphasis on how they build movements and coordinate action. In the content flows of this media system, racist tropes certainly leak and bleed backwards and forwards between the putative margins and the centre. The far right certainly celebrated last year in speaking about keeping the US safe from refugees, Donald Trump referenced what happened last night in Sweden, an uncertain reference to a lovingly curated body of work online about Sweden as a naive multicultural dystopia, a trope which Trump would seem to have picked up from Fox News, which in turn was a reference on Fox News to a Breitbart documentary, which in turn was produced to capitalise on the extraordinary online fixation on Sweden as a site of apparently willing endarkenment. But Trump's signal boosting of the far right is now a source of media fascination in and of itself, and as Cass Mudda has recently concluded, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, the US extreme right has been reduced to, quote, to an online troll army, which mainly survives because of the disproportionate attention of the mostly liberal media. They have no political relevance outside of their violent potential. Their relevance, he is also in a sense suggesting, is this circulation, this diffusion of presence and ideas. So my analysis here remains focused on the dynamics of debatability. And to move to conclude this point, but also to a more general conclusion, the question is, what does this circulation of digital racial debris mean for the desire to name racism and oppose it, which we started with? In his book Alter Politics, Ghassan Haj argues that anti-racism, and here he is much more critical of academics than activists, has been conceptually rather ossified, he argues, and is always trying to catch up with the racist's fluid modes of classification. The problem, he argues, is a kind of scholasticism, where the performativity of racist statements, and more obviously racist practices, which is what is most important to the racists themselves, is given far less attention than needed. Instead, the racists' greatest sins are made to be interpreted of intellectual ones. They're accused of being bad thinkers, they're essentialists, they deviate from classical racism, or they're making false statements about reality that the anti-racist academic can empirically correct by highlighting a lot of statistical data that proves them incorrect. No, there aren't that many asylum seekers trying to get in, or no, there are no ghettos here, look at the demographic data type argumentation. I agree with this critique of scholasticism, but I think there's a further bind at play. During the so-called refugee crisis, academics and public agencies did work hard to provide data, to visualize it, and to communicate it. Of course, this has little or no impact on the circulation of fake news about refugees, because while the circulation of faked and laundered sources of information is important, what is often overlooked about the trendy and somewhat ahistorical notion of fake news is that it has a racialized grammar. Stories of immigrant influx, crime, and sexual violence circulate not just because of clever manipulation or internet dynamics, but because these racial stereotypes are well established. They are the felt truth of fake news. And yet public institutions, of course, cannot just give up on their guiding commitment to the idea of a public sphere and not provide this data. The problem is placing too much weight of corrective expectation on its provision. Bearing in mind again that media clearly does not define practices of anti-racism, I want to finish by raising two questions that this context, this increased fluidity and performativity of racist articulation, may pose. Whoops. In his essay, Is It So Difficult to Be an Anti-Racist?, Michel Vivorca argues that racists are not troubled by possible internal contradictions, but anti-racism cannot function this way. It does not stand in a perfectly symmetrical relationship to the evil that it opposes. It becomes ineffectual and even counterproductive the more it appears to be incoherent, and worse still, incapable of overcoming its contradictions. Whereas racism draws its strength from amalgamating the processes it affects. In this context of digital racial debris, this dynamic that he's talking about is potentially wound tighter. And the answer to it, I'm not sure what the answer to it is, but the answer cannot be this scholastic pointing out of internal contradictions. It cannot be attempting to match blow for blow these shifts in assemblage and scavenging, and it certainly cannot be the artificial imposition of unity. It lies perhaps instead in the building of shared understandings, not as an artificial imposition of unity, but as a form of collective intellect that builds ways of resisting and contesting racialized discourse where and when it matters, and that can integrate media logics but also operate autonomously of them. But here I'm in danger of replacing scholasticism with another academic sin, one that really gets my goat, which is that form of magical thinking that looks to social movements for the solutions in the last paragraph of a lengthy analysis. Never do that. If there is a dimension of debatability that I think needs to be contested right now, however, it is the burden these dynamics produce for black or Muslim or minoritized people when they speak out about race in public, or, as Stacey Patton points out, when asked or compelled to respond in certain ways. Think about one of the most vengeful forms of racial debris in Asher Min's terms, the supposed return of racial science. Here again, post-racial certainty and media abundance combine. In the absence of racism, science exploring IQ, hereditary qualities, or human biodiversity should be treated as scientific propositions that can be debated and refuted rather than silenced. We should have that confidence. You'll have heard this argument often enough. And every time a huckster scientist has protested on a university campus or writes an opinion piece that they're just asking the question and being silenced, this is used to launch an open debate, the first one since the last one, which was, of course, just 2 days ago. When the dynamics of debatability are obscured by liberal assumptions about the sanctity of public debate, it produces not deliberation, but what I want to call deliberative distortion. That is, myths, talking points, dog whistles, ritual provocations, everything short, basically, of overt hate speech, should be responded to as if they are disinterested contributions to public culture. The targets of racializing discourse are, in effect, appointed the custodians of public discourse ethics. They're compelled to respond to messages that undermine their humanity as if these are contentions worthy of debate, and as if the ritual and performative racist contentions derived from these kinds of repertoires are somehow open to engagement or open to refutation. They're being asked to extend and amplify discourses which are not open to deliberative engagement, but in the name of dialogue. And I'm going to leave it there because these, I think, are the kinds of dimensions that I'm trying to bring out, where there's a certain affinity between the ways in which these media dynamics work and the nature of post-racial racism's work. And the question then is how and when to engage and to confront this politics of racism. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gavin. Okay, sorry, my voice is gone. There we go. If people indicate for questions or contributions for Gavin, I will take you as I see your hands.
Do you think that the various debates we've had about politics of identity in general, sometimes in relation to critiquing the universal subject and so on, have been either helpful or unhelpful, or perhaps even not both, in dealing with racism, which is perhaps itself a form of identity politics? Do you think that's relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, and I think there's two ways of answering it. One is some sort of substantive engagement, which is very difficult because what gets coded as identity politics, I'm always wondering what that really means, because some people, as we know, some people engage in identity politics, other people engage in politics, and this is a kind of a recurring way in which this is set up. And it's also, I think, in terms of the kind of argument that Asher Min makes about how certain kinds of tensions emerge at certain moments in relation to the politics of race. There's this sort of resurgence of thinking about identity politics at a moment now of, well, can't we get back to basics? Can't we get back to, for example, a class-first analysis? Or can't we get back to a universal subject that will allow us to mobilize to take on the real enemy, and therefore really, to caricature it a little bit, but it's not that far off this caricature. Can't people really take their somewhat, excessive or what's the word I'm looking for? Not excessive, detachable politics, and sublimate them in the services of the real politics. So, I mean, that's a debate which I really sort of steer clear of, because one of the things that irritates me about the way in which identity politics debates are hosted is that there's so little curiosity in the traditions and in the authors and in the ideas that are associated with identity politics. I mean, I never see anyone critiquing identity politics who's read, for example, Alcoff's work on it, for example, which walks through all of these kinds of class first and other sorts of objections. So that's a substantive answer, if you like. The answer in terms of these kind of media logics is, again, and I mentioned it in relation to this weird sort of right-wing, but not only right-wing media focus on student politics, is that identity politics becomes one of those spaces where a sort of legitimate or legitimized dismay at how far anti-racism has gone can be sort of assembled. So for me, it's something which is very much in the genealogy with the sort of anti-racist busybodies discourse of the 1970s. Look, we all admit that racism is bad, but this is just excessive. You're making excessive demands on us. And the problem is, in terms of these kinds of dynamics, is you can always, in terms of the sort of explosion of media content, you can always trawl through and find something which will be the next, scandal, which will be the next event, which will set off these kinds of debates again and again. And I always wonder why people are so eager to participate in debates which are obviously ritual. In other words, they circulate around the repetition of the same kind of ideas and the same kind of positions constantly, and yet we pretend that this is some kind of substantive debate that moves politics on. So I think it's bound up in some of the things I'm talking about, certainly.
Thanks, Gavin. I'm trying to get my mind around this concept of the way we should conceptualize debatability, as you said, communicative conditions or giving rise to community conditions of talking about racism, or also the endless invitations to discourse. Do you consistently consider this concept of debatability as something which is perhaps, I don't know, monolithic or homogeneous, or do you detect facets to it? For instance, debatability is promulgated, say, by the kind of content produced by established media networks, Fox networks you mentioned earlier, Fox News, or indeed sort of the kind of content created by individuals, whether they be from organised sort of far-right sort of points of departure, or indeed whether it is by normal people. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think even calling it a concept is maybe to glorify it or to give it a status I don't think it has. I think it's more kind of a heuristic, a way of thinking about what these dynamics are actually doing. And the reason I use it in a sense is to try to separate it out from the kind of default idea that public debate has a deliberative orientation, that public debate is the way in which we achieve forms of agreement or consensus or shared concepts or whatever it might be. And instead to emphasize this sort of recurring and recursive nature, the ritual nature, that a lot of these things kind of recur while looking like debate. Now obviously within that you can go to the different kinds of dynamics and content creation that you're talking about there. But
so it's not a speech act, as it were. It's more of a.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose it involves speech.
Public.
Yeah, it involves speech acts. But I think what I'm trying to get at is the way in which it renders certain kinds of issues debatable. As if, for example, as I said, there's constantly two sides to an issue, or that because we have reached this kind of post-racial certainty, this confidence that racism doesn't exist, we can explore those taboos, or we can go and look at those ideas again, or we can listen to the kinds of ideas which we know are wrong and we know that have been discredited, but under these conditions, why not debate them? Why not allow them and legitimate them back into the flow? So it's those kinds of dynamics, I think, that I'm really trying to get at, but it's mainly as a concept marking distance from the kind of, rationalist deliberative inheritance, which is the way in which we continue, despite the evidence of I think, how media works, how power works, is the way that we continue to talk about public debate, not just as a kind of a normative desire, but as if this is how it happens and how we should orient ourselves to it.
Thanks, Kevin. I thought that was terrific. I think it's a great concept, the debatability thing. Seems to me it really does take us quite a long way. I was wondering if, correct me if you go into this in your book, but it seems to me that you're actually pointing at quite a number, almost several genres of debatability.
Yeah.
One of which you drew attention at the start is might be described as pseudo-rational. It's the sort of, I'm not, post-racial is obvious. I'm not racist. It's a version of I'm not racist, but in which you offer apparently empirical, rational kind of construction to defend the position of non-racism. And then, when that blackface thing flashed, it occurred to me there's actually another kind, which is actually, you might describe it as minstrelsy by proxy, where you have a debate about racism, which then enables you to have a sort of frisson about racists. So there's usually a kind of social othering that goes on as well. Often, quote unquote, white working class people do this racism, which the liberal commentariat, who are apparently not racist, can then produce this spectacle.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of remote secondary form of it's endorsement, but it appears to be unfair. So it does go on. And then I thought, well, when you get to the end, of course, it is a quandary, isn't it? Because actually you do have to speak the truth and say it's bullshit. You do actually have to engage in a kind of form of rational argumentation yourself, in which you're actually pointing out that actually none of this stuff is true. And that seems to be a central plank of anti-racism. So, as always, we're having to deal with very, very slippery ground when we're talking about race and other forms of domination too. It's just as true in the case of gender domination of class too. While at the same time engaging in rational debate. And that's, I guess, what your point, isn't it? That that's the tricky thing. It's how to actually incorporate those different dimensions which seem to be pulling away at each other.
Yeah, I mean, and these comments are very helpful because I think it also helps my thinking and what are these different genres or what are these different orientations within this concept and not just kind of marking this debate. And I think you're right, and I think that idea, that frisson is very important as well, to be able to, there's a certain move which is very central to these genres, which is we need to have this debate because look what's happening over there, right? And the reanimation of that after Brexit, of course, as well, and not just after Brexit, but after the Trump election in the United States, that sort of by proxy, we need to have a sensible debate about migration because look, this is what the white working class apparently thinks, without any thought being given to the kind of mediation of that as a form of public opinion. I mean, the ways in which this is polled or the ways in which this is produced by particular kinds of technologies, particular kinds of interests, is just sort of left out of it. And what's also left out of that particular debate in Britain, which I think is interesting, is that that idea also recurs at certain moments. In the aftermath of the riots in 2001, for example, there was an enormous amount of political investment in this notion of also the left behind, the white working class, who are existing in a parallel community, only it's their community hasn't been given the benefits of multiculturalism, and we need to look at what the consequences of that are. Again, something which is really just a set of discourse games by the political centre, but which, as you said, is given this sort of faux sociological weight or sociological reality. And this is something that, Finney and Simpson's work, for example, is really, really good at looking at that, about the kind of racing of facts, as they call it, in that aftermath. The final point that you make is really the kind of the question, and I think it's what Vivorka tries to get at when he says, as we know, anti-racism is not just opposing racism, its logics are not just diametrically opposed to the logics of racism. So while, as I was trying to argue, this sort of constant ability to sort of pick and mix and to assemble gives a certain sort of force to contemporary racisms, it's not something that gives a force to opposing those racisms, so it's not something that's easily reproduced. And that's why I went back to, as I said, or stopped around this question of the kind of magical thinking, because I think that the answers to that really do need to come from forms of mobilization. They need to come from tactics that people engage in themselves. And I think what I do look at in the book is something else, which is that, of course, this space is also a space in which people play with and try to develop different kinds of anti-racist tactics for the online, for example, how to integrate or how to protect or how to take over online spaces, or then how to orient yourself towards, for example, media coverage, or how to use these technologies to organize politically or whatever it might be. So there's a range of things that people are doing. But I think it comes back to this question that there will always be a certain emphasis, as you said, on telling the truth, on undoing the falseness of race, while being aware at the same time that race as a discourse is something which is constantly nimble in relation to that.
Yes, I came to this country roughly 50 years ago. When I was looking for a place to live in London, there was the classical no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, need apply. So I would say actually over the years that attitude, that general way of being racist has very much changed in this country. I mean, apart from IQ and actually then trying to lower and put people actually in a lower level of IQ too, and I think you've got the Irish in there as well, that's been way down, which you've obviously proved differently.
I connect my pads on the way out.
You're talking bit. But unfortunately, I mean, last 2 years ago, 2016, I mean, I was in Kilty Talk in Leitrim. I was on the stage actually with the local Sinn Féin TD, and also actually Mary Lou, who's now actually taken over from Jerry Adams. I was with my wife, who was English, who unfortunately she's died, but I mean she is English, and we were gradually introduced to the masses, well not masses, a couple of hundred people actually, who were there for the various different commemoration things, and various different people on my sister beside me, and Sophie, my wife, was sitting here, and what had happened the previous night in the community hall actually, she had been, she wasn't mentioned. However, I thought, well, they obviously possibly don't know her name, but on this, the platform actually with Mary Lou and, I'm trying to remember his name, actually just recently elected, Martin, anyway, so, but again, on the stage, as they were introducing, we had she was ignored again. So prior to that, I really thought that Sinn Féin maybe had stood for something different. But the expression that I had to experience, which did anger me intensely, was actually racism against my wife who was English. And unfortunately, if that is the attitude of what is quite a main party, it really is a bit, I mean, I found it very offensive, and all I wanted to do was blow my stack and really have a total outlook, in which Sophie didn't really want me to do. So I suppose personally, having seen the movement here actually moving perhaps to a certain extent away from a racist attitude, to then suddenly find it actually suddenly appearing in Ireland in a reverse way, is there a period, or is there a way of dealing with this? I mean, obviously, academic analysis reaches the academics. The main media tends to actually have reaches the common denominator, which unfortunately they do tend to actually bring up old tropes and use them to actually further their own political aims. So I mean I'm just at a loss actually. What is a way of dealing with these things?
Well, I mean, that sounds really, really nasty. I mean, I think nationalism always has these ambivalences and always has these tensions within it, and I can't speak for Sinn Féin obviously, but all as a movement, there are also divisions around how people think about republicanism and how people think about its relationship to nationalism. And there's a tendency always in Irish nationalism to anti-Englishness, which is the republicanism of fools, frankly.
Yes.
And it is also something which, again, in terms of this kind of latency that Ashamid is talking about, if you look at the current sort of stage of the Brexit negotiations and the kind of the tensions around negotiating the border, it's quite easy for sections of the Tory party to mobilise a particular kind of latent sort of anti-Irish sentiment, but it doesn't go very far. But then on the other hand, it's very, very easy when you have, in some ways, a radically unpopular Prime Minister in Ireland who's able to mobilise a certain sense of standing up to the English. That also unleashes certain noises in the blood, which are politically kind of crappy in my opinion as well. So internationalism for all is the short answer.
Okay, thank you. Anthony?
I'm not sure I've got a question, but I was thinking of two things I'd read, so I just basically want to ask if you've read them and if they resonate, and they'll make sense when I say what they are. One is Kimberly Crenshaw on post-race in the Baffler, and saying how post-racism actually enables current conjuncture of racism, the current form of racism, and whether that argument that she makes, if you're familiar with it, if that kind of has resonance and if it's not. And then the second thing is Liz Fakiti's new book, European Fault Lines, where she's saying this kind of logic, dynamic, you've articulated really brilliantly, is very closely tied to centrist politics. I mean, I know you sort of said that, but she talks about collusion, and she's saying, this is very active racism. There's not even a denial of racism. There's very active racism, and the state and the police, and it's a depressing sound. But yeah, what you would think about that argument? Because she's sort of saying this is very concrete. This is very embedded in the change to legal systems. It's not just a discursive.
Yeah.
Sorry if they're not.
No, but absolutely. I mean, in relation to Kimberly Crenshaw's argument, absolutely. And the reason that for the sake of sort of structuring a talk, I structured around Goldberg's argument is because I think the way he talks about postracialism as it captures exactly that idea that this is an active process. This isn't just a series of sort of, mythologies and complacent assumptions about a so-called post-racial present, but that it is in this sort of absence of race that racial ideas and racial practices are formed. That is the generativity that I was trying to capture. But the Crenshaw piece in the Baffler is a really good articulation, I think, of the same kind of logic. As to Liz's book, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, I think it's always one of the dangers, or and put it another way, as somebody who's in the media studies department, I always feel if I talk about media that I'm in danger of sort of wandering into the realm of the hyperreal when we talk about discourse, or we talk about sort of media structures that we're not in relation to racism, that we're leaving behind the sort of concrete material and political realities of how racism is organised in Europe. Of course, I'm not. It's just it's kind of a different topic. But I think what Liz does really well in that book, and what she has done extremely well constantly, is to insist on that relationship, to insist on, if we look at the notion that Hess had of the residuum, that it's pushed over there, the sort of media logic of thinking about the far right is like opening the fridge every few years and it's still there, and close the fridge, and then open it again, and what's happened with the bacterium, and close it again. When you have that, then you get this very spectacular form of coverage. Sometimes very good journalism, but sometimes a spectacular form of coverage that doesn't and can't pay attention to the ways, not just she documents that very often there's collusion with security forces, of the blind eye of the police and so forth, but that so much of the political repertoire, and I had a kind of line about it, does come from the political centre. If you look at studies, for example, of the far right in Europe during the 1990s, anti-Muslim racism, for example, has almost no place in the repertoire. The becoming Muslim of refugees is something that happens at the centre of European politics. It happens among Christian democratic parties and social democratic parties. And it's a kind of a compensatory politics. It's a sort of a culturalist politics that emerges around compensating for the obvious sort of frazzling of social democracy and the social offer. So particularly in relation to the welfare state as now something which has to be sort of racialized as ours, and this is a small country that can only contribute so much. All of that kind of stuff comes from the political centre in Europe. And I think what Liz Fakiti's work always does is to insist on that. It doesn't start out there and drift in. The repertoires, the ideas, the structures, they're already within the gates.
That was the question I was going to ask, because I can't find where you said it, because your talk was full of some brilliant phrases. We were saying about discursive laboratories, and I think opening up the idea of the debatability to the conjuncture, the moment we're in. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about that, because anecdotally Ireland seems to me to be not fascinating and not depressing, but bonkers when it comes to Islamophobia.
Yeah.
How quickly the vocabulary became domesticated. When, first of all, there wasn't, okay, that's too complicated, but it just seemed to me to happen bizarrely quickly, and it felt that there has to be an explanation for why, especially if you generalise it out to some of the more serious and more organised movements in Europe. So the conjuncture is, on the one hand, the war on terror, on the other hand, austerity, but even that doesn't seem to explain this.
Yeah.
It's too fast, widespread, and persuasive for lots of people who would otherwise, I'm not a racist.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. point, and I mean, you could also, because I think there is a tendency to try to explain racism, reduce it to a kind of consequentialist analysis of capitalist contradiction that can't account for nationalism, can't account for the racial dimension of how the nation is composed and how that's mobilized at certain moments. So, you know, for me, the test case of this is Norway, where at the moment a young hijab-wearing journalist in Norway is being terrorized from speaking in public quite openly, in the right-wing opinion pages, online, in amongst certain politicians and sort of political actors, and this is happening in the wealthiest country in the world. So we can never buy, not just buy that reductionism, but also need to explain and think about, is there something particular about the way in which, yes, anti-Muslim racism has been mobilized, that it's able to take on this kind of productivity very quickly in very different political cultures. We could look at this in relation to Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. And it can't either be reduced just, for example, to the political conjuncture or Catholicism or historical victimhood or whatever it might be. I think within that the media does play a certain kind of important role, which is precisely just this sort of dissemination of easy tropes, of talking points, of what would appear to be a kind of a knowledge that can be reproduced. I mean, again, you know, not just online, but in how many sort of articles do you read where there's a sudden flowering of Quran experts, right? In other words, all of these people who are capable of this amazing textual exegesis to prove that actually Muslims are kind of theological automatons that act in relation to what the Holy Book says. There's all of this kind of, what Jason was talking about, is this kind of pseudo-rationalism is bound up in it. But I think it also can be explained in terms of just the sort of, a certain kind of sensationalism. I remember the first time that I started to think about this was watching The Journal, which is a very popular online Irish news site, which was one of the first to sort of break the hold of readerships from the main newspapers, which are hemorrhaging readerships anyway, but this is a free online news site which does quite well from advertising, it's quite professional. But I was reading it one day and there was an online poll saying, should Ireland ban the burqa, please vote? Now, well, I mean, the thing was that there was like hundreds of comments under this, but the first comment was something like, you clickbait bastards, right? In other words, people really knew what was going on. So it was partly clickbait. This was around the time when Sarkozy was going hard at it in 2010 around these sort of meetings for national regeneration, and the burqa came up as something which apparently the people wanted banned. So it's obviously, it travelled through the coverage of this, and it directs people to the news site and so forth. But I don't think that only that explains it. So I tweeted at the journalist and said, what are you doing? And of course the temptation at this point is always to say, you know, there aren't that many women wear the burqa in Ireland anyway, and by the way, your picture is of a niqab, not a burqa. There's a brilliant French activist site which sort of documents this, the way that pictures from around the world appear to be on the streets of Paris or Nantes or whatever it is. But of course, you know, that would be to play the wrong argument as well. So I asked them just what makes this a news story, and I said, well, it's an issue that people have an opinion on and which they would like to debate. So I mean, that partly is a genre of debatability, if you like. Something's happening in the news, it doesn't have a social referent, but it can have a media reference, which is what's your opinion on this. So on the one hand you've got the clickbait logic, on the other hand you've got the kind of racializing logic, and on the other hand of course you have the professional journalistic logic, which is everything has two sides. You can actually have a debate about this. We're just giving the public the tools to express their opinions. So again, I don't think there's never just one logic, of course, but precisely in relation to this sort of, as you said, this kind of rapid sort of accumulation of a sort of fluency of these kinds of racisms. That's what's very difficult to explain.
Sometimes you can just curse them out,
yeah.
Call them effing racist, effing out.
Yeah.
What if it's your mom?
Well,
Just like
I love you as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got Jasmine and then Bob.
Hi. I want to say that I really appreciated the concession that you made at the end about not giving a big academic talk and then saying, oh, and on to activists to do that job. But I was interested in the kind of opposition between or whether there is an opposition between like this scholastic obsession with whether or not rationality can disprove racism, whether that works, and then kind of opposing that to direct action. And would it not be more fruitful for academics to be moving their energy from these repetitive debates about these are the facts, this is why you shouldn't be a racist, to a kind of not on the streets direct action and academia on one hand at either side, but a kind of merging of these two things. So there's a kind of progressive, structural racist debate going on, not just this kind of here's the data and whatnot, and how that might work.
Yeah, well, yes. In short, I agree with you, and this it is something I didn't talk about for the reasons that you mentioned, but it is something that I do think about a lot, because it's precisely to avoid this kind of projection. Look, isn't it great? The activists are taking care of it, and also, well, because as we know, what's very difficult at the moment. And it's something that Ramsey Kushan talks very nicely about in his book, The Left Hemisphere. He talks more generally about the absence of what he calls mediating institutions. In other words, where is it that sort of collective intellect is developed within political movements? And he's looking at the sort of the great sort of the modern European left more generally. But I think that the kind of point that he makes about not just where do, for example, academics / activists, or activists and academics, and of course communities who are implicated by these issues, and who are also academics or activists, where do they meet and develop ideas? But how are they translated? How does forms of praxis emerge from them, which is, we could say, scholastic in the sense that it's rigorous, it's working through the ideas, but it's very much thinking about the political heft of the idea, not just its media logic, as I was saying. I think there are examples in the work that I've been looking at in racism in the media. You can see moments where there are very interesting things happen. For example, some of you might have come across this really nice little book from the early 1980s called It Ain't Half Racist, Mom, which is a selection of kind of small essays by people involved in the campaign against racism in the media and the Black Media Workers Association, where what worked in that context was a series, not the idea that it's just we need to put pressure on the media externally to change what they do internally, but to change the nature of the internal-external relationship, to work through trade unions, relationships with local communities that felt misrepresented by the newspaper, or whatever it might be, and to host these and to organise together in ways that create a form of kind of counterpower within the media institution. The reason I think that's much more difficult today is, for example, because trade union membership is down and journalism is a very precarious piecemeal occupation, where with the expansion of the production of the news comes, of course, changes in the nature of the workforce as well. So that kind of, for me, would be the question, how would we reimagine what something like that would look like without saying, let's set up a Facebook group, right? But would have those tools available. How could we reinvent what those successful forms of sort of cooperation, mobilization looked at previously, but not romanticizing them, not just trying to do the same thing because it's not possible under the same kind of conditions. So I know I'm not giving you really kind of an answer to it here, other than to say that for me, I think that's really where this needs to go next.
This isn't so much a question as a sort of observation, an invitation to comment. One of the things that strikes me about the argument you're making is that one of the things that very, very broadly the left hasn't been very good at doing is finding a balance of some sort between freedom of speech and scapegoats on the one hand, and on the other, the notion that does not entail that everything is debatable. I just wonder if there's some interesting theoretical work that we know about around that tension, because it seems to me so important.
I think it is, and I think it's the current debates about free speech, and I know Anthony's been thinking about this a lot as well, are striated through what I'm looking at here. In relation to what you're saying, there's a very conservative answer that can be given, which is that so much of the talk about freedom of speech is obsessed is the wrong word, but is only operating in terms of a kind of non-instrumental sense of what freedom of speech is. It's simply the freedom to express, leaving aside all the kind of strategic political questions for the moment. But the other tradition in classical liberal thought on freedom of speech is, of course, the instrumental, the consequentialist way of thinking about it. It's also about what you say. So the idea that there's a kind of, you know, you have speech theory over here, and you've got race critical theory over here, and you've got sort of classical liberalism here. It's not really the case. There is a strong tradition of saying that you are also responsible for your ideas, that you have to think about the life of your ideas in the society. So for me, one of the answers to this is actually quite a conservative movement. Say, well, if you call yourself a free speech liberal, then, you know, embrace your tradition. That it's not just a sort of relativist sense of all must speak, and here's where the politics comes in, because of course it's only certain speakers and certain forms of speech that animate these very intensive contests about, or spectacles or moral panics about the status of free speech. So for me the question, and it is something I've started to think about, is we could look at this another way, or we could pose the question of freedom of speech in a number of ways. The first is to say there are a huge range of ways in which freedom of speech is actually under threat in contemporary society. The book that Kathy mentioned that I edited and finished on the Charlie Hebdo aftermath. In 2015, they were the first journalists killed in a year of extraordinary violence against journalism. And as we've seen last week in Slovakia, that open political targeting of journalists in non-conflict zones is something which has been increasing. Now, it would have been possible to understand what happened to them as, yes, an assault on freedom of the press, yes, an assault on individual freedom of speech, but what happened, as we know, is that they got taken up as a civilizational expression of the unique French capacity for and value of freedom of speech, which is something which is threatened by racialized minorities within France who are too communitarian and cannot accept, you know, that they're being insulted into modernity, which is essentially the kind of the argument that went down. So the first thing would be to say that attacks on journalism, the nature of intellectual property, of copyright, of all of these different kinds of regimes are extraordinary threats to freedom of speech, but they're not what come up when freedom of speech debates erupt. What comes up is so often on this terrain of what you can say about race. And I think that that's something that we really need to unpack. What is it, again, about this kind of post-racial moment, this desire to be free to say, not just to say it, but to say it unopposed, or to say it in ways that are made comfortable for one to say it. And that goes back to what Jason was talking about there. I think that's one of the areas where I think to say, no, I don't participate in this, is, I think, crucially important. Not to participate in debates that are an invitation to amplify something which we have already, if you like, won hard-won victories to show that this is illegitimate, or that this is racializing, or that this is wrong, or whatever it might be. And again, we could go on with that, and we could look at, for example, the status of campus. What is the university campus in these debates? Because the university is not just a realm of the free exchange of ideas, it's a realm in which ideas are graded for their veracity, graded for their value, graded for their public contribution. So on that basis, again, a very conservative one, why should certain racial scientists be given a platform? Because they've got nothing to contribute. But I think there's a lot vested in this sort of constant iteration of freedom of speech as something under threat that I really want to look at.
Last one, yeah, go ahead.
Really small.
Snappy.
It's not so much the left here. I think it's the liberal centre which has been appalling on freedom of speech, and it is miniaturised. But this isn't a case study or an anecdote. It's a miniaturising of something that's happened far more widely. Is the appalling failure to engage with preventing campuses. Something that has turned campuses, and not just universities, but also in FE, in schools, in doctors' surgeries, in any benefits office, into places where you have to racialise your clients as outlined by the state. This isn't the left. This was done, it was done by over a sequence of governments, but more or less accepted as something that had to be done by many people who think of themselves, or regimes that think of themselves as classically liberal, old humanist-style liberal, and that somehow or other this was too difficult or too embarrassing to fight or to deal with, including many people in the institution we work or study in. So I think in this instance, the left, I was listening to Mick Cohen, some of you might have been as well on the radio yesterday evening, lambasting the left for failing to support those members of Muslim communities that come out and say, my community is misogynistic, the Quilliam type nonsense. And his voice is so familiar on stuff like this. And you might say, well, the left fails to combat him. That's not about the left, that's about Mick Cohen being, if you like, some sort of exemplar of contemporary liberalism.
I don't disagree with that, I just don't think the left has done the theoretical.
I mean, I think just to finish that, prevent is really interesting precisely because prevent doesn't come up in these freedom of speech spectacles. And I think that it's not just prevent, I think there are a range of ways, and again to go back to the sort of Charlie Hebdo aftermath, there was enormous force of law brought to bear on speech in the aftermath of that incident, where I can't recall, I won't try to speculate on the detail of it now, but a variety of forms of law which were used to prosecute incitement to terrorism or to prosecute essentially insulting the institutions of the state and so on. In other words, what happened was, on the one hand, you have the celebration of freedom of speech. On the other, you have a kind of legal apparatus saying that certain forms of political speech are not actually political speech and therefore don't come within the realm of how freedom of speech operates as a sort of, discourse within which we think about what should be said and who should be able to say it in society. So I think that this is one way to go back to what Bob was saying as well, that we could do that theoretical work, which is to say not just what forms of speech are at the heart of the debates that take place about freedom of speech, but what are the forms of political speech that aren't even recognized as political speech or that are legally or judicially or politically put beyond that realm. And I think and whose speech is it? And then we would come back very quickly to the kind of racialized formation of those debates.